Parables. One of Jesus's quintessential teaching methods was to speak in parables. In the Synoptic Gospels, those of you who've been in Bible study know what that word means. It means they share the same source material. So that would be Mark, Matthew, and Luke, those three Gospels. We see lots and lots of teaching that occurs in parables. So this method of teaching is not new. Jesus did not invent this. It is an ancient method of teaching. The prophets often spoke in parables, so he comes from the prophetic line. He knows the prophets well, so he adopts their means of teaching. He's also surrounded, of course, in his time by Greek philosophy, and Greek philosophers also taught a lot in parables. So why parables? Why parables? That's the question I'm going to see if I can answer today, and then in the next 5 weeks we're going to explore very particular parables. There are lots of them, so I had to pick just a few that we're going to look at closely. So the parable of the sower, the guy that takes the bag of seed and goes out and throws it on all kinds of ground, is probably one of the most well-known. The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son are probably the top two. But that one is very familiar, I think, to many people. It's found in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, because they all share the same source material. It's an interesting story. It tells us that Jesus has a crowd that's gathered to hear him when he tells this. And I imagine, they've come for some tips, right? Like maybe they want 7 habits of, highly effective Christians to be told. I mean, I could just picture me there with my notepad. I'm ready to write it down. I'm ready to learn something. Jesus, come on. Maybe he could give us here's 50 ways you can simplify your life or something. And instead, what they hear is a parable. And Bible scholars call this one of what they call challenging parables. A challenging parable. And a challenging parable is one that makes you really have to think, because on the face of it, it doesn't make any sense. John Dominic Crossan, a teacher and an author of many books about the Bible, a Bible scholar, says about this particular parable, the parable of the sower. Just imagine, all right, it's the first century. It probably would have been pretty much mostly men sitting in the crowd listening to Jesus. Most of them would either be farmers themselves, or they would be very familiar with how to farm. And this guy Jesus gets up, and he says, listen, I want to tell you a great story. It's about this sower, this farmer who grabs his best bag of seed, and he goes out and he throws his seed out on all kinds of ground without even thinking about where the seed lands. So the birds come and eat some of it. He throws it in soil that has roots and rocks and weeds that choke it. And he throws it on some good soil, and it produces a good crop. Now, so imagine, you've got a group of farmers, they've listened to this story, they go home, and one of them says to their wife, hey, I heard this great story today from this wisdom teacher. It was all about a farmer who took all of his good seed and threw it all over, even on really bad ground. Now imagine his wife looking at him and saying, you spent all day listening to an idiot? Seriously, everybody knows you don't take good seed that costs a lot of money and throw it on bad soil. So if you have ever planted anything in your life, ever, or been around anyone who plants things, you know that either Jesus doesn't know a single thing about farming, or this is not actually a story about farming, right? You might imagine somebody in the crowd, somebody who couldn't keep their mouth shut. When Jesus says, yeah, and then he throws the seed, the good seed, on the rocky soil, and it doesn't take root or produce a crop. They might say, duh, right? So here these are, these parables, these pithy little stories. They are a very distinctive, very peculiar way of teaching. So why? And we heard this morning when Marta read for us, that in the Gospel of Mark it says he teaches in parables on purpose. He doesn't teach in plain, simple language. Why would he do that? Right? If you want to get your message across, that seems a very odd way to teach. I mean, he could have made a handout with fill in the blanks, right? I mean, did you used to do those in school? And they had one answer that you're supposed to write in each of the spots. So you get the point. Everybody gets the point. So what Jesus is doing is he's actually using a method of teaching that is very interactive and a method of teaching that teases our minds into active thinking, into being engaged. A method of teaching that makes the crowd say to each other and to him, what are you talking about? This guy doesn't know anything about farming. And then somebody else might say, well, maybe this isn't a story about farming. What do you think it's about? You can just imagine, I imagine when Jesus tells his parables that there is a lot of conversation happening. I even imagine a few brave souls in the crowd questioning him. And I always, when I picture the scene, imagine him smiling. Because I think he loves to engage people in active thought and debate. So I imagine that these stories, they would sink into you. You would go home, you would talk to your neighbors about them. The neighbors would say, I don't know, that doesn't sound like very smart advice. So let's figure out what this story really is about. The parables teach us that God's dream for the world is only going to be realized when we, the listeners, engage our whole hearts, our whole minds, and our whole bodies in these stories. When we, the listeners, wrestle with these stories and figure out how to use them in our daily life. Whenever I read a parable, I often find myself identifying with particular characters in the story. And every time I read one, I often identify with a different character than the last time I read it. So, for example, when I read the prodigal son, sometimes I think, yep, I'm like the prodigal son. Sometimes I am very self-centered and act like I'm entitled to things. And then I also see myself in the older brother in that story of the prodigal son. The one who won't come to the party that the father throws to welcome home the younger son when he returns. The older brother who stays outside thinking, I never went away and squandered my fortune. I've been here this whole time working hard. So sometimes I see myself in that older brother. I notice the ways that I can be self-righteous. the ways that I can choose to perceive myself as the good one who is not appreciated enough. This is what parables are meant to do for us. They're meant to get us asking questions about ourselves. How is the soil in my own heart? You might think, after the parable of the sower. What kind of seeds am I sowing? Or after you read the parable of the man who finds the treasure in the field and sells everything he has to go buy that field just to have that treasure, do you think, when have I stumbled upon grace? When have I experienced a gracious moment in my life? Someone forgave me. And did I give thanks for that? Did I appreciate that gracious moment? Or did I think, oh, I deserve it? Or maybe I just got lucky. So Jesus says over and over, you'll notice this reoccurring theme throughout all of his parables. He says, let those who have ears hear, and let those who have eyes see. What's he talking about? I mean, most of the people in his crowd can hear and can see. He's talking about a different way of seeing and hearing. Allow the kingdom of God to come nearer by identifying how you are like these various characters in the story, by noticing the ways in which you sometimes act in ways that are not like the kingdom of God. Parables are actually meant to make us feel uncomfortable, to provoke us, to push us, to unsettle us a little bit and help us think about how are we like these folks that we think, I don't want to be like that older brother, or I don't want to be like that prodigal son. Because God is in the transformation business, right? But we can't be transformed if we don't first notice the things that might need some transformation. Jesus says, I speak in parables so that those who listen not with their ears but with their heart and mind can hear. So the parables force us to ask questions. They force us to discuss and debate the meaning of the parables. They are unexplained stories. In only a few of his telling of parables does he actually later summarize what the point is. Usually he just puts the story out there and leaves it. We never know, for example, did the older brother in the prodigal son story ever go into the party? We don't know. The story ends with the brother sitting outside of the party, feeling grumpy and self-righteous. So Jesus, in his enigmatic way, explained God with unexplained stories. And those of us who really want, like a book like Christianity for Dummies, we find this really irritating about him. But that's the point. The point is that we don't get a neat set of answers. The point is not to be troubled. Do not be troubled if you find these parables difficult to understand. Do not be troubled. Because you know what? The disciples who are right there with him 24/7, they don't get them either. As a matter of fact, sometimes he's rather nasty to them when he says, "What are you guys, a bunch of dimwits?" that they don't understand him. Jesus sometimes comes across like a Zen teacher, giving people koans. Koans are these sayings that don't really have a rational answer to them. His greatest desire is to provoke. It's to tease out questions. It's to get people thinking outside of their normal range of thoughts, to open their minds and hearts. So these are invitational forms of speech. So invitational forms of speech are things that invite the listener to see something they might not have otherwise seen. They are invitations to see differently. And so the questions you might ask when you read a parable are these. What is Jesus inviting his listeners to see in this parable? What is new or different about this way of seeing that he wants us to get? His parables also represent an alternative wisdom. Let me say more about that. An alternative wisdom. His wisdom undermines and challenges all of the social boundaries of his time. All of the ways that people around him decided who's in, who's out, who's good, who's bad. And we do the same thing today. So he offers an alternative wisdom. Let me give you some examples of, in Jesus' time, conventional wisdom, the normal thing, right? What everybody seems to think, you might say, and his alternative wisdom. Conventional wisdom in Jesus' day said that God is a punishing lawgiver and a judge. So God's keeping score, right? Jesus' alternative wisdom said that God is gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast mercy. The conventional wisdom of Jesus' time said that a person's worth is determined by measuring up. How well do they measure up to the social standards? Jesus' alternative wisdom said all persons have infinite worth as children of God. The conventional wisdom of Jesus' time said that sinners and outcasts are to be avoided and rejected. Jesus' alternative wisdom says everyone is welcome around the table, and everyone is welcome in the kingdom of God. Conventional wisdom says identity comes from your social tradition. Jesus says your identity comes from being sacred, being rooted in the center. The sacred center, being rooted in the sacred center. Your identity comes from your relationship with God as God's beloved. Conventional wisdom in Jesus' time said, strive to be first. His alternative wisdom says, the first shall be last, and those who exalt themselves will be emptied. Conventional wisdom said, preserve one's own life above all. And Jesus' alternative wisdom says, the path of dying to self and being means that you are reborn into life abundant. And the last one, conventional wisdom said that the fruit of striving is rewards. And Jesus' alternative vision says the fruits of centering yourself staying in close relationship with God, is compassion. I love the story of the sower because to me, the sower, I often identify the sower as God. God who is so frivolous with God's mercy and generosity and love that God takes the best of all seeds and just tosses them willy-nilly wherever they land, not worrying whether the soil is worthy, whether the soil will produce a good fruit. This God of ours is extravagant. This God of ours is frivolous, and a little frivolity in the church is probably a really good thing. I think for too long, so many churches have been in the business of judgment. And maybe it's time to follow Jesus of Nazareth and to be joyful about being in the business of blessing. Let us be known here at Emmanuel as a faith community that always errs on the side of blessing rather than judgment. Thanks be to God.